We're gonna wait till we get Bridget in here, or SR71 for us to be able to start with a co-host so we don't lose the space when it kicks me out. Um, Thus far, this is probably the first time in the better part of a year, there she is, that I haven't been kicked out of the space. So um, who knows? Who knows what's going on? Um, okay. So, how are you today, Miss Bridget?
Hey, we are both freezing, so that's always a good day.
Oh my gosh, the weather here was beautiful today. We were out taking walks in the stroller. I wasn't actually in the stroller, I was doing the walking.
Well, it was 18 degrees this morning, so we're not there yet. But I have seen some mythical 50 something degrees that are supposed to come the next couple of days, and I'll take it.
Absolutely. So, what did you think about the interview last night?
My mind was blown. I mean, I knew that these guys had not just a lot of a difficult time and that they were attacked and that, the midnight raids and that kind of thing. But when he started talking about them sticking in Al Qaeda
in the bed next to him.
It's so much worse. It's so much worse than we even thought. And to have his spirit not just not be broken, but his love for his country better, stronger, bigger, more. And it kind of goes back to that they never should have locked us down.
Yeah.
All it did was make us stronger. They have done so much to try and not just break his will, but break our will. And all I've seen is the resolve and the coming together.
I agree.
Stronger and bigger, and boy, they really screwed up.
So I agree.
In his case, man, I can't wait to see what legal recourse ends up coming back for these people who have just suffered like really a third world country.
Yeah, and I don't know that most people realize the A-10, which is the aircraft that he flew, they fly low enough that they can see people's eyeballs. The name of their mission is close air support with the emphasis on close. And to have someone who has flown combat sorties and it's just there's so much because we know that the CIA trained and equipped and funded Al Qaeda, and to think that not only were you over there risking your life taking them out when in fact your government has created them, for your government to stick one in a bed next to you while they have you in a federal prison for exercising your rights is really beyond the pale. And the more I thought about that, the more I'm convinced that their plan was to assassinate him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly what came to my mind. And this is what they do. This is what they've done and what we've been uncovering in all these other countries.
Yes.
It's killing someone with someone else's hands.
Killing someone while they're in prison.
Right.
Yeah.
And orchestrating their assassination with plausible deniability or whatever kind of a cover.
Yeah.
By doing it with someone else.
Yep. Yeah. Quite incredible. All right. We're going to dig into Vietnam. Like I said, I'm not sure. This is a pretty long chapter. I'm not sure we're going to get it all done. But I do want to, in the spirit of us understanding this guy's point of view, kind of want to go through this chapter. So even though we've covered Vietnam quite a bit, because he does have a couple of very interesting points in here. This one starts out with you guys remember Ed Lansdale, the PR guy from Northern California that we keep stumbling across in the Philippines and then eventually in um, Vietnam. And he's the guy that come up with the campaign to pretend like the psychological operation to pretend like a vampire. So they killed the one guy that was the last guy in the formation, and they poked holes and bled him out. And the holes were poked to look like vampire fangs. Yeah, that's this guy. So he is obviously, and remember, he brought a whole bunch of his trained killers from the Philippines to Vietnam with him. So it talks here about the fact that he was involved in all of those psychological operations. And then it says his other work at the Pentagon in the Office of Special Operations, Lansdale occasionally got the chance to vocalize his views. One such occasion happened in 1959. Now, remember, in 1959, this is the last year. I mean, they had the election in 60, so this is Eisenhower. And it says that Eisenhower had authorized the Air Force C-130s to fly special aid supplies of construction equipment to certain upland villages in Laos. They were carrying things like construction equipment, blah, blah, blah. Lansdale made a tour of the area, adding the Philippines and Vietnam in addition to Laos. And then he came back and wrote a very long report about civic action needed in the form of counterinsurgency. Again, this is actually going to be insurgency, window dressed as quote unquote counterinsurgency. Lansdale argued his case with great zeal. He also had special credibility in this case as the author of the special Filipino anti-hook HUK campaign, for which he was awarded a national security medal, because psychological operations of murdering people and pretending that they were attacked by vampires definitely gets you recognized back in the day. Despite his excitement, Lansdale's strategy was controversial in the pre-Vietnam era bureaucracy, even in the CIA, where political action was more widely accepted as opposed to counterinsurgency. There was some people there that favored direct responses, but not necessarily, they weren't as enthusiastic as Lansdale. At the beginning of 61, which is when Kennedy came in, just a few weeks before the inauguration, Lansdale was ordered to South Vietnam to make a fresh assessment. Briefly, he found that the government had increasingly been ineffective in the countryside and was losing the guerrilla warfare. Civilian control over the armed forces was such that Diem, the South Vietnamese fake president that the CIA installed, had barely survived a military coup attempt 2 months earlier from a paramilitary colonel. The U.S. Military Advisory Group, with which Lansdale himself had served from 54 to 56, was too small and too hampered by local restrictions. Lansdale spent a little over 2 weeks in Vietnam. He spoke with Diem and other political and military figures and the U.S. Embassy. He compiled a report on the plane back. He submitted it January 17th, 1961, which is very interesting because they're actively murdering Lumumba right about that time too. In the normal fashion, the report presented a vision of an operation, quote, changed sufficiently to free these Americans to do their job that needs doing, unquote, which basically means murder a whole bunch of people. In Saigon, Lansdale found American and Vietnamese officials whose attitude reminded him of the French and the Vietnamese in Hanoi in 1953 and 4. He believed Vietnam was undergoing a psychological attack that in 1961 would be a fateful year, and that Vietnam was in critical condition and should be treated as a combat area of the Cold War. The answer was to pick the best people that you have, in Lansdale's opinion, quote, a hardcore of experienced Americans who know really like Asia and the Asians, unquote. The new U.S. ambassador should be sent immediately. A new U.S. ambassador should be sent immediately, as well as mature American, like person in charge, to conduct political operations to start creating a Vietnamese style foundation for more democratic government. And by democratic, they mean dictatorship. This report created some stir in Washington. A guy by the name of Walt Rostow, Rostow, who we come across quite often, showed it to Kennedy on the afternoon of February the 2nd. The president was busy and didn't want to read the whole thing, so Rostow told him that he should. And when Kennedy finished reading, he said, quote, "This is the worst one we've got, isn't it?" unquote. He also went on to say, Eisenhower never mentioned this. We talked at length about Laos. He never mentioned the word Vietnam. Now think about that. Eisenhower had been doing covert operations to include involuntarily relocating via psychological operations over 1 million people in Vietnam using the Catholic Church. And he never uttered one word to JFK about Vietnam. They talked about Laos, never about Vietnam. The SecDef wanted to hear from the author himself, so Robert McNamara asked Lansdale to come to his office. Casting about for some kind of dramatization, to dramatize the Vietnam situation, Lansdale scooped up a handful of rebel weapons, stakes and spears, still caked with blood, which he had gathered to ensure the special forces could include them in their new museum. He literally dumped the stuff on McNamara's mahogany desk, explaining that the U.S.-equipped South Vietnamese were being beat by rebels with these instruments. Lansdale figured that this was the best way to use his 5 minutes with the SecDef. Somehow, I found him very hard to talk to, Lansdale would later say. Watching his face as I talked, I got the feeling that he didn't understand me. Imagine that. It was the Pentagon that derailed Kennedy's plan to appoint Lansdale as the new ambassador to South Vietnam, reportedly with threats of McNamara's resignation. Several more attempts to assign Lansdale to Vietnam in one capacity or the other was blocked until 1965, when Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge overrode all opposition. In the meantime, Ed Lansdale had retired in 1963 with the rank of Major General. In Vietnam, psychological warfare would function strictly as an adjunct to the conventional military force. One recommendation of the Lansdale report that made it through the bureaucracy was an effort to improve Washington's handling of Vietnam matters. Kennedy formed a committee to canvass the alternatives and present him with a list of options. Given the Pentagon's status as the biggest player in Vietnam, it was not surprising that McNamara's deputy, Roswell Gilpatrick, chaired the group. Lansdale's fan in the Y Club, Walt Rostow, favored nominating the Air Force general to serve on the committee, but the Pentagon would have nothing of it. The Gilpatrick committee faced a difficult task. Many of the members had entered the new administration and were just finding out about all of this. Gilpatrick's own recollection is that none of us who were charged with the responsibility for this area had any preparation for this problem because Eisenhower had never mentioned it. What we didn't comprehend was that inability of the Vietnamese to absorb our doctrine, to think and to organize the way we did. Nevertheless, Gilpatrick's group came back to Kennedy with a menu of 40 options, which is ridiculous on the surface. Kennedy's decision in this initial case conditioned much of the subsequent U.S. experience in Vietnam. Between doing nothing on one end of the scale and committing the U.S. forces on the other, JFK chose a graduated expansion of the U.S. effort, beginning a cycle that would be repeated many times. In the case of Gilpatrick's recommendation, Kennedy approved some of them in National Security Action Memorandum 52, which was a directive which he signed on May 11th. The U.S. would expand the military advisory group and pay for a 30,000 man increase in the South Vietnamese forces. Of particular importance for the secret warriors was in the memorandum, it included deployment of special forces Green Berets, 400 of them, with a mandate to expand the present operations in the field of intelligence, unconventional warfare, and psychological operations. Kennedy also searched for a strategic concept he could use to manage this conflict. Counterinsurgency theory suggested population resettlement, leading to the strategic Hamlet program, which we would refer to as smart cities today. But basically, what they did, if you guys remember, is they moved everybody out of a village. If you wouldn't go, they killed you. Then they burnt the entire village and they built new huts with moats around them and then checkpointed everybody in and out so that nobody could leave and they could all be tracked. And they created a computer database that had everybody's information in it so that you basically became a hostage in your own country. Geography suggested that the possibility of sealing South Vietnamese borders and preventing infiltration was a challenge. The border control approach was being touted early in May 1961 by Robert Comer, Komer, a CIA analyst that had been detached for duty with the National Security Staff. The twin pillar of pacification, which is basically intimidate the hell out of everybody until they quit resisting, and isolation, which was building these villages and isolating the different cities from each other, so that they basically couldn't talk to each other. In the summer and fall of 1961, Kennedy briefly flirted with sending combat forces to Southeast Asia. The possibility arose in the context of the Laos situation, but it was desirable also from a Vietnamese standpoint. The American occupation of Laos might have had the effect of blocking Ho Chi Minh Trail, which the North Vietnamese had built in 1959 to use as a supply route. That November, Kennedy faced the recommendation of regular American forces being deployed to that area, and this time Maxwell Taylor and Walt Rostow, who had just returned from a trip, was suggesting that that's probably something that was needed. Rostow had taken Ed Lansdale along with him on a special assignment to compile a survey for unconventional warfare. The Taylor-Rostow report also included recommendations for a radical increase in the number of Green Berets, along with increased covert offensive operations against the North. Once more, President Kennedy rejected the troop request while approving almost everything else. Indeed, more secret warriors were reaching South Vietnam. The same day he sent Taylor and Rostow to Saigon, JFK had ordered out an Air Force combat detachment to bomb the supply lines of the rebels, meaning Ho Chi Minh. The unit sent was the 4400 Combat Crew Training Squadron, a special warfare jungle gym unit, which became operational November 16th, 1961, which means it's basically brand new. And it flew secret air missions, codenamed Farm Gate. This deployment was part of a much wider expansion of American forces in Vietnam. The size of the assistant group rose from 700 when JFK took office to a year and a half later to 12,000. There were many more military advisors, U.S. supply units to support the Vietnamese, helicopter units, special forces, Navy, Air Force, Marines, blah, blah, blah. Farmgate retained its clandestine status while Semi-clandestine units followed. They used mule teams to fly short range air transport, and ranch hand, which was another code name, which dropped toxic chemicals like napalm to burn the foliage. Vietnam's contingent could hardly be called a group anymore, so they redesignated it as Military Assistance Command, and the figures rose by 1963 to be 22,000 people. Conditions in South Vietnam deteriorated despite the increase in forces. Government officials were increasingly vulnerable to the dangerous countryside. It was evident by 63 that President Diem had lost most of the political support that he had, and his brother began using force to quell demonstrations by the majority Buddhist in the country. They were operating under the auspices of being Catholic. The feeling in the Vietnamese army was that the political crisis was making it impossible to prosecute a war against the North. There was lots of talk in Saigon about a coup. Those early days in Vietnam were an adventure for Americans, much like Korea had been a few years earlier. In the first days of South Vietnam, it had been Lansdale who had established a close relationship with Diem. When Lansdale left at the end of 56, the liaison role remained the major activity in Saigon. Later, the role grew much larger. In addition to being a liaison, the CIA wished to have its own source among South Vietnamese politicians and interest groups. By 1960, the agency was supplying the best information outside of the presidential palace, save perhaps a few of the Viet Cong intelligence networks, which of course was the North. Indeed, in 1960's coup attempt, the CIA officers had been in contact with the plotters throughout the entire proceedings. This caused some difficulty for the CIA's station chief, who at the time just happened to be William Colby. Another task put on the CIA's list at this time was assistance to infiltrate North Vietnam using Vietnamese special forces, which had been formed in 1958. They were setting up paramilitary teams and training them with the CIA. Army Colonel Gilbert Layton, Layton, was detailed to the CIA to supervise the effort. By 1961, the agency had set up 4 of these teams with 8 men each, but the units conducted operations only inside South Vietnam. Suggestions for commando raids in the North were resisted by intelligence specialists who preferred to implant agent networks before making attacks that would encourage the North to strengthen their security. By the late 1963, when President Kennedy asked for plans to land paramilitary teams in the North, NSC advisor McGeorge Bundy, who Warhamster and I were just talking about the other day, warned him that the operations against North Vietnam presented many of the same difficulties as other denied areas. Colonel Layton, Colby, and other CIA officers had far more success with paramilitary efforts in the South. They began experimenting with the creation of armed forces among the tribal minority in the Central Highlands. At first, the purpose was self-defense, and then upland counterparts were beginning to be used as strategic hamlets, which would then cut off the supplies headed south. One result of the Taylor-Rustow report was approval of an initiative to put the tribal program on a much more formal footing. The tribal units would then become civilian irregular defense groups with fortified camp bases and leadership from the Green Berets. From 1961 to 65, 80 base camps had been developed. Special Forces participation increased dramatically from 1 medic on temporary duty in late 1961 to the first A-team deployment from Okinawa in February of 62 to a peak of 3,480 by 1968. Until November of 1962, this new civilian irregular defense plan was entirely a CIA responsibility. Thereafter, operational command was gradually transferred over to the Military Advisory Command by the summer of 1963. So the CIA sets it up and then hands it off to the U.S. Military. By then, Colby had left Saigon for Washington, succeeding Desmond Fitzgerald as chief of the plans for Far East Division. So he's still in charge. He's just doing it from Washington. Colby's place as chief of station at Saigon was taken by John Richardson, an officer from the Army Counterintelligence Corps who had joined the CIA. Richardson was an authentic espionage hero in Italy back in 1944 to 45 when he was instrumental in helping capture the German agent Carla Rossi, Rossi. Richardson stayed on at the Army Counterintelligence and switched over to the CIA afterwards. He had been assigned to Italy, Vienna, Trieste, which is the northeast, just north of Venice area of Italy, and moved to Saigon from Manila, which of course would put him in close proximity with Lansdale. A veteran secret warrior, it was Richardson who, in the denouncement of the Albanian campaign, had been given the job of closing down the operation. Richardson's style was not unlike that of John McCone, who let his subordinates carve out empires so long as they did not cross him. There were different empires too. The Saigon station, no longer the homogenous unit of 40 that William Colby encountered in 59, the paramilitary crowd made up one circle, the espionage crew made up another. Since 1961, there had been a communications intelligence circle as well. One of the CIA political action men played a major role in the demise of President Diem, and his name was Lucien Koenig, Conein. He's the guy that was left over from France and was part of the French special. He was crossed between a mafia guy and a French OAS. And he also is the one that eventually helps Richard Nixon take down the Corsican mafia, because he was basically playing a double agent. But while he's here during this period of time, he basically is undercover as a lieutenant colonel assigned to the Vietnamese Interior Ministry. So he also was very familiar with all of the inner workings of Vietnam because, of course, the French had been there for a long time. So he had actually went to some of the same training classes with William Colby and had run agent operations out of Eastern Europe after the war, which of course is where we got the World Anti-Communist League crazy people in Eastern Europe that were all war criminals that we brought over to the United States, thanks to this guy. He had also been a Jedburgh and a veteran of the French commando operations in northern Vietnam in 1945. Koenig had also been a member of Lansdale's 1954 to 56 intelligence mission with links to the Vietnamese army and also to the Philippines that Lansdale brought over to Vietnam. Of course, the biggest empire within the CIA was Richardson's own. It was customary for station chiefs to maintain certain relationships, in particular with the chiefs of the host intelligence services. Thus, Colby handed over to Richardson his relationship with Nguyen Dinh Nhu, now the chief of Vietnamese intelligence and special forces. He was a man who spoke 4 or 5 different languages, including French. He was indispensable in Vietnam. Richardson had been a classmate of Richard Nixon at Whittier College in California. Richardson's problem was not the Vietnamese, but the U.S. government. Convinced that Diem's time was running out, the U.S. was desperately trying to get a Vietnamese president to make concessions and broaden the base of his government. Prime movers in this effort were the Assistant Secretary of State for Far East, a guy by the name of Roger Hilsman, Hilsman, and the American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge. In August 1963, a notorious incident occurred when Hilsman, evidently with preliminary authorization, but while Kennedy was out of town, drafted a cable insisting that Nguyen must go. If Diem would not fire his brother, then the United States was going to have to look for alternatives. Nguyen's special forces had just carried out a series of bloody attacks on the Buddhist pagodas that was widely condemned. I mean, they were setting themselves on fire. It was a hideous scene. Lodge was enthusiastic about the cable, though he advised against any ultimatums. Jocko Richardson, however, reported back through CIA channels that the ambassador had regarded the cable as an order to support a coup d'etat. Richardson opposed this. At Langley, William Colby backed him up. John McCone was on vacation, but was quickly informed that they also opposed any coup. Although a cable from the CIA chief on August 26 instructed Koenig and a CIA officer by the name of Alfonso Spero, Spero, to tell the Vietnamese generals that the substance of Hillman's cable and to say the U.S. would not oppose a coup if they could conduct one. McCone went on to oppose the coup initiative, and he was soon joined by Taylor, McNamara, and LBJ. The Hillsman cable was scuttled. Lodge considered that he had been undermined by John Richardson. He insisted on the transfer of the station chief. Richardson was abruptly recalled on October 5th after little more than a year on station. For a time, the Vietnamese generals backed down, but 2 days before Richardson's hurried recall, Koenig was told by one of the Vietnamese that a coup was being planned. That coup was carried out on November 1st, 1963. Diem and New, and the latter equally hated wife, died in custody of the plotters the next day. Thanks to Koenig, the CIA had a front row seat to the coup planning, if not the precise timing. Now, other authors have actually connected the coup to the CIA, that they were actually involved in it. As for his opinion of the U.S. support for the Diem coup almost 2 decades later, Ed Lansdale said, "I think we should never have done it. We destroyed the Vietnamese constitution. Not we, but the people we were working with." We, not the people you were working with, is correct. Okay, there would be several more coups before 1967. Soon after the Diem coup, William Colby went out to Saigon to pick up the pieces. He had Richardson to dinner the evening before he left Washington. The top priority was to replace the station chief, and Colby called in Pierre DeSalvo, D-E space S-I-L-V-A, recently sent to Hong Kong after a long tour as CIA chief in Korea. And remember, we had just overthrown that country too. There, he had seen a coup close up. De Silva had a strong background in espionage, particularly the Soviet Union, and had been an officer in charge of security for the atomic bomb project. In Vietnam, he was called on to preside over the escalation of paramilitary activities. Escalation was mandated by LBJ, Kennedy's sudden replacement in the Oval Office. If anything, LBJ was even more receptive than Kennedy to arguments about graduated military force. Like the planned 6 strikes against North Vietnam, for which Walt Rostow had argued in 1961. 4 days after assuming office, LBJ approved National Security Action Memorandum 273, which called for a study of different levels of increased activities, including statements resulting in the damage of the North and ensuring plausible deniability. The directive also called for planning and conducting military operations into Laos and many measures in South Vietnam. The Pentagon planners came up with O Plan 34-A, which Johnson immediately approved. The requirement for deniability immediately involved the CIA. De Silva's station was ordered to redouble efforts to infiltrate agents into the North. McNamara had the mistaken impression that CIA drops proceeded at a rate of one a week. Instead, McGeorge Bundy told Johnson on July 24th that there had been a total of 8 CIA drops so far, and they had been very modest, basically with minor contact. Another secret warfare program under CIA was a more ambitious effort to make coastal raids on targets in the North. The CIA procured and armed a number of very fast motorboats called swift boats built in Norway. There were also slower but heavily armed nasty boats. Commando units of Vietnamese special forces used the swift boats for raids, often accompanied by American quote unquote advisors. The need for Green Beret and SEAL expertise in operations of this kind led the Military Advisory Command to organize a studies and observation group called a SOG, as Unconventional Warfare Task Force in January 64. Among the 34A operations, which were carried out by air and sea, was the delivery of propaganda um, leaflets that were airdropped into the area. By late July, only 3 seaborne missions had occurred that were considered successful: the demolition of a bridge on Highway 1, the partial destruction of a storage area, and the temporary interdiction of water pumping station. By late July, there was another swift boat raid to shell North Vietnam's radar station and facilities in the area of the Gulf of Tonkin. The Hon Mi raid, inadvertently or otherwise, coincided with other U.S. intelligence operations, a quote unquote DeSoto patrol into the Gulf of Tonkin. DeSoto patrols were made by U.S. Navy ships and were intended to collect comms via interceptions. Ships carrying out those operations had enhanced equipment for radio intercepts, direction finding, and traffic analysis. DeSoto patrols had long been carried out off the coast of China on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek and the Soviet Union. President Kennedy had approved a similar program for North Vietnam in 1962. When the first of those patrols was carried out, there was a second DeSoto mission in 63, and the destroyer Craig made an intercept cruise in the Gulf of Tonkin in March of 64. There is some evidence of a further DeSoto patrol in July. In any case, the destroyer Maddox was on a DeSoto patrol when it arrived in the North Vietnamese coast to find 4 swift boats passing her on a southerly heading. The 34A raiders returning to base. That evening, the Maddox was offshore of the islands that were recently shelled. In response, the North Vietnamese sent their own torpedo boats, which attacked the Maddox in international waters the next afternoon. They were driven off after one of the torpedo boats was sunk and the others damaged. Johnson deliberately ordered the Maddox back into the Gulf of Tonkin, accompanied by other destroyers, one of which was called the C. Turner Joy. 2 destroyers together, 2 nights later, mistook instrument readings for a second attack. Now, I want to stop because obviously we know this is the false flag that created the impetus for us to go full bore into Vietnam. Now, I want to point out a couple of military facts here. All of what we just described here is basically the equivalent to not as sophisticated, but you've got these reconnaissance ships that are intercepting. They're like the USS Liberty, guys. The same one that got attacked in 67 and, we're right before that. And so you have ships that are basically the all-seeing eye at the time. They have the comm equipment on to pick up all signal communications. They have the ability to scan and look at what's going on. They're everywhere, right? There's multiple ones in this area. So they go and actually bomb North Vietnam and aggravate the hell out of them. They send torpedo boats out as a response to our bombing them. And then Johnson sends the ships in to basically affect the quote unquote mistaken attack on the Navy ship that creates the Vietnam War. This was all, number one, preventable, but number two, planned for that exact reason in order to invoke a war. Every bit of it, all of the equipment was there to ensure that shit didn't happen. So there's no way that they thought something was bombed that wasn't bombed, that they didn't know where everything was, because he just said they have multiple ships there that has basically similar capability of the USS Liberty. So just keep that in mind. That's a big fucking deal. All right. So President Johnson retaliated by ordering carrier strikes on North Vietnam. The early reports were, which mistakenly cited as many as 6 enemy craft and 9 or 10 torpedoes, impelled Johnson to go to Congress and ask for the congressional action approved called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, August 7, 1964. This resolution was then used to declare war in South Vietnam. McGeorge Bundy's immediate problem was what to do with DeSoto. As a reconnaissance project, DeSoto patrols were approved by a special group, renamed the 303 Committee by Johnson, which is basically the 4512-2 special group that we keep renaming every time we get a different president. Bundy was chairman of that group and should have made the decision. Because of LBJ's extreme sensitivity to developments in Vietnam, this question was taken up directly with the president. Both DeSoto patrols and the 34-A operations were temporarily halted while Washington debated the policy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff argued for open military action, bombing North Vietnam, and relaxing the rules of engagement of actual combat military forces. Maxwell Taylor, who had become the ambassador, so the general retired as a 4-star and goes and becomes the ambassador in Vietnam. He favored action, but only after waiting until December to see if the Vietnamese political situation stabilized. Like Kennedy before him, LBJ accepted other recommendations involving less than maximum options to resume the DeSoto patrols and 34-A operations, reinforce Farmgate with heavier B-57 jet bombers. Thus, operations like DeSoto and 34-A, which could be considered provocative, were suddenly approved not on the merits, but on alternatives to even greater provocation. President Johnson specifically approved resumption of the naval patrols on September 10th. The 34-A operations were to resume as soon as the first DeSoto patrol was completed. McGeorge Bundy was in his office on 9:15 a.m. on Friday morning, September 18th, when DeSoto had another false alarm. The new patrol in the Tonkin Gulf consisted of the U.S. destroyer Morton and Parsons, which reported they had opened fire on 4 radar contacts that they believed to be torpedo boats at night. The initial response of the Joint Chiefs was that the U.S. should immediately attack the North and their air bases and all of their oil facilities in the Hanoi Haiphong area. Cooler heads prevailed for a moment. Information that afternoon and the next day made it perfectly clear that there had been no premeditated attack, though North Vietnam's boats may have been in the area. Early in October, when 2 more destroyers were designated to conduct another DeSoto patrol, the ships were specifically equipped with star shells, photographic and sound recording equipment to provide records. These ships were also sent on an exercise in friendly waters and underwent mock attacks by day and night using the nasty boats from Da Nang. Had the original DeSoto patrol made such preparations, there might never have been an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. As such precautions were in the purview of the 303 Committee, one wonders just how much attention was being given to them by the special group. not only for DeSoto, but also for all kinds of covert operations. The CIA, at least, felt itself to be under tight control. According to a 67 memorandum, and this is a quote, the policy arbiters have questioned CIA presentations, amended them on occasion, denied them outright. The record shows that the group and committee, in some instances, has overridden objectives from the DCI and instructed the agency to carry out certain activities. Objections by state have resulted in amendments or rejections of election proposals. Suggestions for air proprietaries and support plans for foreign governments. The committee has suggested areas where covert action is needed, has decided that another element of government should undertake a proposed action, imposed caveats, and turned down specific proposals for CIA action from the ambassadors in the field. The State Department participants in the 303 committee, like Ulysses Johnson, also felt the special group monitoring was rather strict. Johnson himself earned the Dr. No label for his frequent casting no votes on the committee. Yet the period of November 63 to February 67, the 303 committee approved 142 covert actions. This averages out to 5 per month of covert action. Considering that the 303 committee normally met only once a week and that the proposals were submitted in advance for discussion in the departments before the department heads came to the meeting, that was a lot of work to be staffing all of these different proposals. The gains from all of this were strictly limited, but the lessons learned by Kennedy were lost. Bundy was quoted as saying, quote, in 1961, I listened with a beginner's incredulity to the arguments of an eager operatives who promoted what became the Bay of Pigs. Through the next 2 years and more, I watched with increasing skepticism as the Kennedy administration kept the pressure on the CIA for more and better, if not smaller, covert operations. I think that eventually I played a small part. His own learning from experience was much more important in President Kennedy's growing recognition that covert actions simply did not work and caused more trouble than it was worth. Kennedy's demise and the replacement by Johnson ended the potential for a change in policy on covert action. Certainly, the 303 committee approval figures cited above demonstrate that Bundy was unsuccessful in stemming the tide of covert action, many of which would be executed in Vietnam. In the Central Highlands of South Vietnam, it did not matter what the policymakers were saying in Washington. Here, the war effort progressed slowly while special forces attempted to seal the border and cut off Viet Cong supply trails. Unlike many other facets, the military advisory command work and the local programs involved Americans directly rather than as advisors. In the fact that the lowland Vietnamese had little affinity for many of the tribes, which were in the area, like the Montagnards, and were at first willing to give the CIA and special forces a free hand. The program began in October 1961. And one of the 18 major Montagnard tribal groups, the villagers of Buon Inyo, agreed to accept American arms and training. Men from the Vietnamese Special Forces, officially called the Luc Long Doc Bien, or the LLDB, were included in these missions from the beginning. In theory, commanding them, but often functioning more as observers, where the Americans ended up being in charge. The LLDB had a lot of interplay with the Green Berets. By December 1961, the Montagnards had cleared out an enclave containing 40 villages and 14,000 tribesmen. The American had armed 975 as village defenders and 300 more into mobile strike forces, known as Mike forces. A year later, there were 200 villages and 60,000 in this area, with 10,000 self defense forces and 1,500 Mike forces. The method was repeated in among other tribes. The let's see, Nong Train, a port city on the central Vietnamese coast, was the hub of this tribal war against the Viet Cong. Farmgate aircraft stationed with there flew supplies to the villages and camps and provided air support. The military advisory command wanted to give special forces their own air units. The Air Force opposed this. The command countered that it would hire Air America to do the job. So the Air Force could then station more planes at Nong Train. The base grew wildly. Vietnamese commandos trained there. The shallow water port was deepened. Major logistics facilities was added, and Special Forces headquarters got redesignated as 5th Special Forces Group, October 1964, and began major operations. One benefit to the 5th group was CIA funding because it had a procurement system unlike the Army's, which allowed local, easy, specialized buying for special forces. Under an accounting arrangement known as Parasol Switchback, the 5th Special Forces continued to use CIA accounting methods for 9 more years after the agency passed control of the Montagnard program to the Military Advisory Command in 1963. The CIA was still basically funding it. As late as March 1965, Nong Train had one of the only 2 stockpiles of U.S. ammunition in South Vietnam, and it belonged to the Special Forces. The group's stockpile eventually was deemed sufficient to supply 40,000 people for 60 days. That's a shit ton. Supporting these camps and actually getting the supplies to them was a completely different story. When there were roads, it was oftentimes unrepaired and very dangerous, and some even blocked by the Viet Cong. The Vietnamese army was scattered throughout this area and not much help. Military support for these camps became critical in the case of enemy attack. The basic reason for having the Mike force units was to ensure that there was the capability of a counterattack should they be attacked. 2 Special Forces officers were captured in an ambush in early 1963. In 1964, one of their areas was overran by Viet Cong. That July, they had just failed to capture another camp, and the Green Berets team held out by sheer determination. Captain Roger Donlin earned his first Medal of Honor awarded in Vietnam for the action at Dam Dong, and 2 of his Special Forces sergeant received posthumous Distinguished Service Crosses, meaning they were killed in action. Her heroism was not enough for Colonel John Spears, SPEARS, commander of 5th Special Forces Group. Spears needed to count on certain capabilities in planning the defense of these camps. Mike Force was the obvious answer, but they expanded far more slowly than the other. 30,000 strike forces and 1,800 Mike Force in October 1965 would later expand to twice that size. The peak was almost 35,000 strike forces and about 5,800 Mike forces by 67. After that, they started falling, the numbers. In early days, the Mike forces were just not big enough nor mobile enough to matter. Colonel Spears met the problem by designating a portion of them as Eagle flights, which could be airlifted into camp areas that were under attack. With a dozen Green Berets and 149 strikers in each of these units, airlift was possible with reasonable size helicopter forces. Such tactics were still in use in 1966 when Colonel Francis Kelly commanded the 5th Group. Kelly told a newly assigned deputy as a man that had just stepped off the plane that if the camps appeared threatened, he would order in the Mike forces by parachute and the deputy would lead the mission. And he had literally just got off the plane. Reaction forces were supplemented with certain special capability units. Earlier, it was called Project Delta, formerly Leaping Lena, Lena, which were joint operations with the locals and the Fifth Group. Delta provided small reconnaissance patrols that could spot the enemy for attacks by air bombardment. At a later stage, the Ranger battalions was added to Delta and they became a more lethal force. Colonel Kelly also added two other special units, Project Sigma and Omega, which basically ran in conjunction with attacks by the B-50 and B-56 detachments of Fifth Group. So basically, they're formalizing a special forces structure there fairly early on that gives you definitely the insight that they didn't think they were going anywhere anytime soon, which kind of lends itself to what we have talked about when we talk about Vietnam and the fact that they were there for the long haul because they were there to protect the poppy fields. This was never about, obviously, we just talked about how the whole thing started. It was all fake as far as the reason we were there, the pretense for all-out ground forces. And keep in mind, that scenario that they used in the harbor there looks awful in the Gulf, the Gulf of Tonkin, looks very familiar to Operation Northwood in the fact that you're basically going to fake bombing ships or actually bomb ships in order to start a ground war. I think there's a lot more to, there's probably a lot more Operation Northwoods than we've ever been made aware of. Because just about everything, to include flying drone aircraft into buildings, has been used off of that plan. Okay, so basically, the author goes on and talks a lot about the tactical details of using all of these forces and a few other kind of false flag-ish type things as it relates to the Viet Cong. And obviously, we talked a little bit about them putting in what we would call stay-behind units in the North in order to try to affect agitation in order to provoke the North into doing things that they wouldn't necessarily do. So, hold on, let me find Bridget. So all of that's going on. And then we get to March 1965 as part of LBJ's search for Vietnam options. You have John McCone, who at that time is now the CIA director, presenting a 12-point program for political action developed under Richard Helms, who is his chief of plans. Breaking with the image of the CIA that did not advocate policy, Helms' memorandum to McCone argued that key activities, quote, should be intensified or initiated in the general field of covert political action, unquote. Further, some of these actions that are covert in a traditional sense of secrecy, but most importantly, non-attributable to the CIA. 7 of the 12 CIA initiatives remain classified 2 decades after the program was adopted. The other points that were recommendations to expand political action teams worked in disputed areas like their striker brigades. The CIA naturally considered such techniques as these to be more subtle than brute military force. This view was not completely shared within the administration, especially the Pentagon, where Defense Robert McNamara liked his options qualified and analyzed. A veteran of this time of half a dozen inspection visits and command conferences at Honolulu, McNamara also periodically was briefed by the CIA. At about this time, Richard Helms was promoted to deputy CIA director, while Desmond Fitzgerald succeeded him as director of plans. In one of the encounters, McNamara told Des Fitzgerald, quote, it's hard to make sense of this war, unquote. Fitzgerald responded, quote, Mr. Secretary, facts and figures are useful, but you can't judge a war by them. You have to have an instinct, a feel. My instinct is that we're in a much rougher time than your facts and figures indicate, unquote. When the Secretary of Defense pressed for more information, it's the guy says, it's just an instinct. Fitzgerald later told Stuart Alsop, a reporter friend, about this conversation, and Alsop then printed a piece that said McNamara had a fixation on quantifying war. The Secretary of Defense decided Fitzgerald had been the source. There were no more briefings by the CIA after that. The elements of the CIA plan were adopted, but the ones we know about were carried out by special forces and not by the CIA. So you have the special forces using study and observation groups as a ploy in which CIA were also embedded in order to work together. Also says, let's see, there were other efforts such as air operations called Buttercup. It reportedly included at least one drop into China. We had C-130s registered in other countries that we were flying and dropping shit in China. So, maritime operations included Timberlake coastal raids and Fascination, an attempt to disrupt the Norse fishing industry. There were also plenty of operations across the border in Laos and Cambodia. The South Vietnamese participated in these efforts. 2 helicopters managed to insert a Team Romeo just north of the demilitarized zone in late 1965. That's what they really were wanting to do, is to basically put stay-behind units in the north. But their intelligence sucked because the north was always one step ahead of them. Another special air warfare unit based in Thailand with the code name Pony Express carried out missions over North Vietnam beginning in January 1967. That year, Pony Express completed 8 of 37 missions assigned. It successfully recovered a special operations team in September 1967. Meanwhile, Vietnamese efficiency declined even further. During the 1968, the Vietnamese completed only 3 of 32 scheduled missions. Finally, the U.S. Air Force, using F-4 fighter jets in Da Nang, was resupplying the special operations team in the Red River Delta region of North Vietnam. That's where the river rats, you guys heard me talking to the lieutenant colonel when I asked him if he was a river rat. That's where the name river rats come from. They basically had a success rate of 20%. The overall effort in the north consumed great resources for very little gain. The only real successful effort was in Laos, and that had much more to do with the Montagnards than with the CIA. So that's the end of that chapter. And next chapter, we actually go into the operations that were in Laos. So it's called the High Plain. That's the next chapter. All right. We are going to open up the conversation to, I see Trump Frog. Hey, Trump Frog, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Doing great. How about yourself?
Doing awesome.
It's been a great space what I've been able to catch so far, so I'm enjoying myself.
Cool.
How are you doing, Bridget? SR, I see Stellar in the building. What's going on, people? You having a good day?
Loving it. I just loved the whole gangster thing going on the last couple of days. Just saying.
You mean Trump and his team going gangster? Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah. Oh my God!
It's been beautiful,
right?
It's everything that we hope for, and all the crocodile tears from all these people. They can, I'm not going to say it's not my space, but I don't feel sorry for any of them. They're sheep at this point, so I'm just enjoying the show. It's great.
Right.
So
I did have a question for you about the recent event that happened with Colombia. Now, my mind immediately snaps to the Colombian cartel. What is your take on the moves and counter moves that took place?
okay, I'll talk about Colombia in just a second.
Okay.
There was some comments over on Rumble about the draft and the draft dodgers. I do want to say a couple of things about this because there's a lot of confusion among some, obviously generally not among the military, but it is worth mentioning to everybody so that you understand the importance. You guys know that we have active duty forces. We also have Guard and Reserve. In the way it's supposed to work is that you have a mobilization authority when you go to war that you call up your ready Guard and Reserve. You don't draft people off the street. But if you're fighting a political war and not a real war, because there was never a threat to the homeland. So if there's a threat to the homeland, you're going to run right through your Guard and Reserve, mobilize all of them, and do the draft, which would have to be voted on by Congress. A lot of people think that that's not even a thing anymore. It is. We still have the selective service, which you have to register for. It just requires Congress to actually vote on that. So there could actually be a draft if our security was ever threatened. But the purpose of a quote unquote standing military is that you have your active duty and then you have the reserve and then you have guard. So if you're fighting a political war and not a real war, which is what Vietnam was, you absolutely do not want to mobilize your Guard and Reserve. Why is that? Because as we found out when our physical security was threatened after 9/11, and you go full mobilization, if you live in, I don't know, pick a place like where Grissom Air Force Base is, which is a reserve unit north of Indianapolis. If you mobilize that reserve unit and its fire department and its cop squadron, you just carved a big ass hole out of your local, probably 3-4 city fire departments and 3 or 4 cities worth of cops. Or if you go to Valdosta, Georgia, and you mobilize a guard unit there, you're going to take not only all of your firefighters and cops out of that area, you are going to decimate all of your, if you've got an AeroMed mission, that will be doctors, that will be nurses. So there is a tremendous amount of hurt that is focused in particular local areas, which all have representatives and all have senators. And so if I take 4 units out of Texas, like Guard and Reserve, I've like decimated a significant part of the firefighters and cops from a particular state that has 2 voting senators and a shitload of representatives. So you damn sure better not be fighting a political war, because your politicians aren't going to be behind the uproar of all of the local communities losing their cops and their firefighters for you to go play pretend war over in Vietnam to protect your poppy. And so that's the reason why it was a conscious effort not to mobilize the Guard and Reserve, because they didn't want the consolidated pushback of mobilizing chunks out of entire populations. And so they went with the draft, which may have taken 1 or 2 out of that city and 1 or 2 out of the city next door and 1 or 2 out of the city down the road and 1 or 2 out of the city upstate. And by doing it that way, they distributed the pain, and you didn't have near the political pushback from local communities. This is our government at war against us. And I want everybody to understand that that was a political decision that they did on purpose in order for us not to push back against them. And we need to understand that. So hopefully that clears that up. Now, let's talk about Colombia. So you guys may or may not have seen my calling what's his name, Charlie Kirk stupid, because what he said was stupid. Okay, so if you look at, and I think this, I had an appointment today, and the lady that I had the appointment with was like, well, what do you think's going on? And I said, I don't know exactly what's going on when it comes to Trump and his positions on these things, but I'm going to take each and every opportunity as we go around the world and we experience these controversial things to educate everybody on what the actual history of those areas are, like I did with the Panama Canal. And I don't care if people think I'm being mean to Trump or not supportive or whatever. I don't really care. If he says something that's not true, I am going to correct it. Now, do I believe that he is saying that from a negotiation standpoint? Absolutely. Because when you negotiate, if you're selling your house and you want $450,000 for your house, you ask for 500, right? You know you're probably going to get 450, but you're going to ask for 500. You don't start at 425 thinking you might end up at 450 unless there's like nothing on the market, and then you basically are driving up prices. And that's a strategy too. But I do believe that he is going well past where he wants to be, saying crazy, outrageous things. But at the same time, it gives people like me who've done all of the research the opportunity to educate people, like I did when I went on Badlands with CanCon and Alpha to talk about Panama. Now, does he consistently keep saying that we lost 35,000 people? Yes, we didn't. We lost about 5,000 people. The rest of them were French slaves from Africa because France started the canal and was 40% done by the time we came on the scene. And the whole thing about the treaty, there was no treaty. We didn't renegotiate a treaty. A treaty requires 2 signatures. Panama never signed the first quote unquote treaty. It was something the United States government shoved down their throat and said, this is what we're going to do because we just finished the canal after we stole Panama from Colombia to begin with. Okay. Everybody needs to know that. Those are all facts. We stole Panama from Colombia, sent our Marines ashore, sabotaged the train, captured the officers, blah, 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 planted a flag, made a phone call, just like we did over in Katanga with the Congo. If you don't like the facts, I don't give a shit. Those are the facts. So I will take every opportunity to educate people onto what those facts are. So now we've got Panama. Now go to Colombia. Well, if you guys go back and click that link on that Box app, we did a whole thing on Colombia, and it's quite fascinating, actually. Colombia has one of the most interesting Operation Gladio histories there is. And Charlie Kirk's ignorant comment about the current president having been a part of a terrorist organization and dressing up as a woman. Let me explain to you guys, if you haven't read the post, why he did that. He was among the group that were actual patriot freedom fighters who was on the side of people whose land had been stolen by places like United Fruit and other U.S. corporations that had went down and corrupted the Colombian government. And they were selling these people's properties to conglomerates in order to create ranches that they then had elite manage for them that were corrupt. And so these people were not basically had their land stolen. And then they started growing poppy on the land that they had stolen. And the people really were pissed off because they didn't want their kids being exposed to cocaine and all of the drugs and the gangs and the terrorists that the CIA was down there with special forces, sending them at one point to the School of Americas to train them how to be terrorists. So the parents were pushing back on the corrupt US corporations in Colombia. Okay. So when that happened, they got labeled, just like everybody else, a communist or a terrorist. That's where this guy came from. That's what the M19 group that he was affiliated with, the CIA called them terrorists because they were fighting back against the CIA corrupt government. So of course they're going to call them terrorists, just like they called the Sandinistas communists because they were fighting back against the Contras, which were the CIA chosen people. So it's just another one of those Latin America things. And if you fast forward to when that guy was supposedly caught wearing women's clothing, they had killed like 70 some political figures in Colombia. And that guy was trying to travel, and the only way they could travel is in disguise. And so him putting on women's clothing to trick the CIA so he could move around and coordinate actions was pretty damn ingenious. And Charlie Kirk's making fun of the guy because he didn't want to show up dead on someone's doorstep with 5 or 6 bullets in his head. So that's what being ignorant in public gets you, is being a smart ass, trying to insult someone who has lived a life that asshole has no idea what that man went through trying to save his country. So he's a dumbass. Does that help you, Bridget? Are you there, Bridget?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, so if you look at the actual, and again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So Colombia, if you guys recall, if you've been with me this entire time, we discovered approximately 20,000 terrorists that Southcom, the United States Special Forces, and CIA has trained in Colombia that has been basically a RENA paramilitary that are used on UN and NATO missions. So like when they had the Kenya guys come into Haiti and they rape and murder, well, Colombia has 20,000 of those trained people that are used in Operation Gladio events all over the world. 20,000 terrorists that have been trained. So if those terrorists that were trained by the CIA are in the United States, I can't say as I blame Colombia for not wanting them back. Now, again, we can be the bully, the big guy on the block, and force them to take their terrorists back that we trained and equipped and paid for, which I think, if anything, we should be shining a light on that. And maybe that is what Trump wants to do. Maybe Trump wants us to do the research and figure out what the hell is going on in all of these places and what the CIA has been up to and how all of these terrorists, again, you guys, my head just blows up when I start talking about this stuff, because how the fuck do you get a million paramilitary people out of Latin America if it's not a concerted effort to train them to overthrow their governments, and the CIA is not behind all of them? Where did they all come from? And how in the world have we spent close to $2 trillion on the CIA's above board budget over the last 70 years and still have these fucking terrorists on our doorstep. How's that possible? Unless it's the plan and not by default, right? It's not something that just mysteriously happens and it's completely out of our control, because we've been able to figure out people walking down the street in Yemen to be able to put a drone missile in their forehead. So if you're trying to tell me that we can't find where all of these people are and take them out, that's just bullshit. You need to use your brain. SR 71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everyone for attending today. Really appreciate it. Say hello there. Anyway, what I was thinking about when I first saw the return of these aliens back to Colombia, and they're getting off the plane, they're all cuffed. And I was sitting there wondering why the Colombian government didn't uncuff them the minute they got off the plane. But I think we know that answer.
Because they're criminals.
The other thing that got me, and I started thinking about it for a minute, when Colombia came back and said, well, we're going to do 25%, and President Trump says, well, we'll do 25%, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, gee, the international syndicate doesn't like being taxed.
Yeah, isn't that something?
So that's where my mind went. Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. Bridget, go ahead.
And you're both pretty much echoing the same thing that, my mind, I guess, with my new Gladio glasses immediately went there. And it's like, okay, we're returning Gladio operators. That's the first ones they're taking out are the ones that have been installed, trained, and inserted within our government. And, again, I'm not shocked totally about some of the people saying, we really don't want these guys back. But it goes, in my mind, to a longer standing plan that was agreed upon that we're seeing play out. But yeah, if anything, it is waking up people as to some history of our country that they never even knew about, and other countries, and those types of things, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That people are absolutely getting a lot more aware, physically, mentally, about how deep and how long the lies have been going on.
And people need to understand that it is not just the CIA. As I pointed out in my response, Taiwan, go Google, not Google, Yandex, Taiwan in parentheses, and Colombia, and look at the, excuse me, look at the connection. The same thing with Colombia and Israel. You're going to find that Eaton guy that was basically the handler of the Colombian president. And each of the installed dictators / presidents, whatever you want to call them, in Latin America, especially in Central America, had an Israeli handler. That's where the Galil manufacturing plants were set up. So yeah, they were all in this together. MI6 is involved in this. There is an entire operation that was going on all of this time, because those other intel agencies in Europe, the B&D, the Italian SIR, whatever they are, they all use these trained assassins on operations there too, as quote unquote plausible deniability. So this was definitely a joint effort.
Absolutely agree.
So I don't see any hands. Anybody else got anything? Money Penny?
Sorry, I'm sheepish putting my hand up. So I did it slowly and I waited. And did you see that gradual movement? It wasn't one of those feisty movements, because I'm a bit embarrassed about this. But being British, can I just ask? Oh, sorry, you were wonderful, by the way.
Thank you.
I don't understand how the Navy and the Air Force and other like Marines and Green Berets and stuff all sit in the United States military vis-a-vis the CIA, the FBI, and the 17, 18 odd intel agencies. So just on a generic level, just so that I'm getting more value out of this, and then there might be other people here that don't understand it as well. First of all, you know what I'm investigating at the moment without going into too much detail.
Right.
There is somebody related to Vietnam in it that is very interesting. That is a Malaysian guy who had 440 naval officers going right back to the Vietnam War, all the way through to 2014, or just before 2014, who was buying prostitutes, hotels, limousines, and everything, and selling secrets of these naval officers of where the ships were going, where the munitions were going, whatever. And as part of that, it starts to talk about some of these guys having been arrested recently, very recently, in the last 2-3 years, in San Diego mainly, and they're fighter pilots. How does a fighter pilot work for the Navy? Can you please please explain to me? Because I don't understand these crossovers.
So you know that Navy carriers have fighter aircraft on them. So the whole idea of our Navy and Marines is forward deployed expeditionary forces. So our whole military is made up of the concept that these floating bases are all over the world called carriers, and they have the first 72 hours of any conflict. So if they're around in the Red Sea, they're in the Indian Ocean, if something pops off in Yemen or Iraq or whatever, the Air Force does not generally have fighter aircraft any closer than a carrier would have that is underway. And so the carrier and the Marines functioning as what you would normally characterize as an Army mission, the infantry mission. So you've got the Marines on the carrier and you've got the fighter aircraft on the carrier. They carry the operations for the first 72 hours. And all stateside and European-based and Asian-based Air Force bases have a 72-hour response window in which they, in the first 24 hours, have all their shit together. The next 24 hours, they're packing their shit up. And that last 24 hours, they're out the door to then relieve the Navy of their first 72-hour presence.
Okay, so that is mind-blowing already, because my father was RAF, my ex was Army, and in the UK, obviously, we do have carriers, and we do call them carriers. That terminology is the same. But we would have RAF pilots on board one of those carriers who would be flying the fighter jets. There wouldn't be that same level of crossover. I don't know of any circumstance where a fighter pilot would be working for our Navy. Our Navy is seen as sailors that do things to do with water. And the minute it gets into the air, the RAF run in and go, no, that's
correct.
my job. And there's quite a strict demarcation.
And so there has been a lot of conversation about that in the United States, understanding that that is the way some other countries organize their forces. However, just to go one better, the Marines have their own fighter pilots too. So
right. This is where, if everybody a medal and everybody gets as many medals as possible for flying over as many bases as possible, it
really isn't that. It really is command and control. So the problem that you have with the way the British does it, where you have Air Force people that are deployed on Navy ships, the command and control of a Air Force guy being operationally under the command of a ship commander gets a little wonky. And what we decided is the command and control of being able to direct all operations under one ship commander was much more important than being able to chop Air Force people outside of the Air Force and put them on a Navy ship, but they still have a dotted line back to the Air Force, because services have distinct cultures and ways of doing business. And so the interoperability of those things causes lots of consternation. So if as
Yeah.
the chief of the Navy, you have all naval operations to include the fighter aircraft on your deck under your command and control. They feel that that's a much more efficient way of doing it. Now, there are the Marines, they chop to the Navy commander while they're on ship. They're under their operational control. So we do have kind of a hybrid model, but it really is about command and control.
Yeah. Okay, so that makes much more sense now. But also, I think it's pretty ironic that you've got the word marine, which to me means water, who are the people
Yes.
that do the army, which means land. And that's confused me for a long time.
So the Army is basically, if you were to, the Marines, if you were to take the Marines and set them aside, if you looked at what was left in the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, and then look at them in one direction, then turn around 180 degrees and look at the Marines look exactly like the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy.
Hey, turn it on.
Oh,
Hello?
Hold on. We're talking. I need to mute your mic. The Marines look exactly like the other three, only in a smaller scale. So the Marines are truly a military, they actually call them that, a MU, a military expeditionary unit, because they have everything. They can deploy to an area because they're forward deployed on the ship already. They can take that entire operation and do land, air, and sea all together for 72 hours. They're
Right,
like a
okay.
mini joint service.
Okay, so somebody that was on one of those carriers who was leaking information from Vietnam War all the way through to 2010, was leaking information, could have also known about information of things happening in the air, not just
Yes.
on the
Yes.
land.
Yes.
That's good. Okay, so CIA and FBI now. I know CIA is more international, so I've got a connection here. In the Vietnam War, all the way through to modern day, if a CIA or FBI person was on one of those carriers, either undercover or not undercover, and would they be not undercover, would they take rank over the captain of the ship?
So that's an interesting question, because what oftentimes had happened in the past, based on my research, is the CIA embeds themselves in a unit with a special record that looks like everybody else's, but they're actually CIA. They're just wearing a military uniform. So there has been CIA agents that show up on a ship as a lieutenant commander or whatever, but they're really, in fact, CIA. Now, they will not supersede the authority of the ship captain, but they may be there doing other things other than what the ship captain knows. And the best example of that was World War II, when you had the two people taking the nuclear bombs on a Navy ship that was given rooms on the Navy ship. They did not report to the captain, but they also didn't outrank the captain. But if anything would have needed to have been done as far as the captain not accommodating them, there would have been messages coming in from Washington, D.C. for the captain to sit down and shut up.
Right. Okay. Wow. Thank you for that.
Now, let me also say something else to you, Moneypenny, because you bring up a very interesting point. What we found when we were investigating the Vietnam War is, and we talked about this during the Vietnam segments, there was a network that was set up by an Army lieutenant colonel and the mafia in Australia. And I'm not going to remember the guy's name. Houghton was his name. He was the number 3 guy at the Nugent Hand Bank in Australia. Houghton owned a restaurant. Beside Houghton's restaurant was a mafia-ran hotel/brothel. They set up with the CIA in theater and the commanding general, Westmoreland, in Vietnam, that they brought all of the R&R, which is rest and relaxation. Like if you've been in theater for 6 months, you'll get a week of R&R. So they were flying Vietnamese or American soldiers in Vietnam down to Australia and putting them up at the hotel / brothel, and had all of the vices there. They had a casino, and they were taping everything that the military officers were doing. Well, if those military officers eventually become general officers, then you've got all of the blackmail material on them already from all of these. And that would be the same thing with what you just said as far as port cities. Most of all of the Navy porting is done under contract arrangements and known well in advance, and would be very easy to get blackmailable information on senior military people and anyone else associated with them, like the contractors, because a lot of the
This is it. That's what I've discovered.
Yes.
This is the 7th Fleet mainly that operates in Asia. Now, Fat Leonard, who's the guy that I'm talking about, who probably everybody's heard of. Leonard Francis is his actual name.
Yep.
It goes all the way back to, I mean, he was in Vietnam when he was younger. But,
Yep.
I mean, this goes back all the way through the 7th Fleet history, all the way through, even, you know, before he was operating it, there was another cartel of Indonesian guys operating it, and it goes all the way through to present day. It hasn't stopped. Indeed, this guy was taken into San Diego and put in prison. He escaped to Venezuela, and he was brought back to America, and he still is, you know, in this case, which involves 440 US naval officers, all the way up to rear admirals who were on sex tapes, who for decades have been effectively, you know, having this issue. Not only that, they've now discovered that the data that's being stolen is held on Chinese servers. I mean, it just gets more ridiculous the more I find out about it.
Yeah, and your the prototype for that was Vietnam, and the arrangement that they had with the mafia, of which Rupert Murdoch was part of, by the way, in Australia. That whole arrangement that was set up there definitely has been used multiple times, but it was very well. And I'll try to get the name of that book. It's out in my cottage, that best described that whole setup, because it, you know what, it may have been the Nugent Hand Bank on archive.org. I'll look it up for you and get it to you.
And also, if you want to track the money that was paid to these guys as part of the bribery and extortion, you can go on now to the United States Payments and Contracts database, which I've been on all weekend, but I've suddenly been blocked from years 2012 to 2016. I've been blocked out of. And you can actually look at the contracts. So I've downloaded, before I was stopped, all the contracts go back to 2012, relating to this extortion, watching what Boeing and the contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, all the military contractors, the Marines, the Navy, everybody, all those payments, who sanctioned them, where they went to. It is fascinating, but it is dirty as hell.
Yep. Well, that's what happens when you have billions and billions of dollars. Yep. Agree.
Take your tape measure with you to the cottage, by the way.
Take my tape measure. I know I owe you a measurement. I know. Carrie, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. So I was listening to a podcast today about the history of Citizen United. Do you know about that?
I mean, I know what it is. I've not done a lot of research on it.
Yeah, I was listening to the whole history behind all of it, and like the lawyers. And what came up for me was that Hillary Clinton was in on it, and she was like the bad man they were attacking. And, you know, it's just an all the elites game. And something else came up, which was that Hillary sold weapon designs to Russia.
So are you talking about Skokovo?
Am I talking about what?
Skokovo. She didn't actually sell them. She set up a project called Skokovo that was supposedly a Silicon Valley counterpart in Russia, in which basically all of the military industrial complex was encouraged to go over there and do development, like joint projects, which basically gave them a lot of our technology. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that.
Okay, I didn't know anything about that. But anyway, they made corporations citizens, and this isn't just like the CIA, the military. This was like an operation basically within the Supreme Court. I mean, it's just, I know everybody knows it's all corrupt, but I just want to remind everyone that they're in everything.
They're in everything. That's true.
They are in everything.
Yeah. Miles, go ahead.
Colonel, I want to thank you for bringing up the subject about the Uyghurs, because now, when you're just a tinfoil hat guy and you're trying to explain some of this stuff about China, which I do know people from China, I worked with them, they don't believe you. They just think you're crazy. So I really appreciate that. And I was co-hosting a really good space talking about getting rid of NATO, and it crashed.
I'm shocked.
I'm really shocked. I'm laughing so much at home. I'm not shocked at all. How many of my spaces collapsed in the last week when I mentioned MH370?
Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, obviously, the worst one we've ever had was Trump Fog the first time he had me on the pond. I think we crashed like 8 times. That was.
I also found the transcripts of these sessions that are now in under declassified sections of the Internet Archive. Everything we say.
Cool. I want everybody to read my shit. Unlike the CIA. Moneypenny, while you're here, I'm going to find this lady's name. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sonia Poulton.
Is it Poulton?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember things. I've got a visual brain. I've got a photographic memory thing, so I remember the shape of words rather than the name of words. So I do remember the name.
So
I the name to a person.
So she runs a radio show in England. And I was on her show this morning, but I had to get up at like 3:30 to be on her show.
Was it LBC? Or
was it what?
Talk radio. LBC.
It was talk radio, yes.
Radio, yes, I thought it might be. Yeah, because I've done bits of interviews there. I'm going to get a copy of it. It's all on YouTube, because it's Talk TV as well now. So when you're on the radio, this is what I do. You'll see on my profile some of my Talk TV things. You'll be on television where your name will be there.
Yeah.
Sometimes I ask you.
She did it on StreamYard, so it was video as well.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, I'm going to get that.
Yeah. And I guess we're going to do it again in like another week or two. She wanted to have me, so I was only on for like 20 minutes, but she wants to do an entire hour to basically go over Operation Gladio, kind of like the Gladio 101 that I've done with other people. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd warn of is, for some reason, I'm sure it's in the US as well, the UK has gone phobically mad in the media about Nazis. Everything at the moment is about Germany and Nazis. And obviously, I know the whole Elon Musk, whatever. But there's a mad thing going on at the moment, because King Charles, our king, is currently with the Jewish Holocaust victims, hugging them on the front page of the newspapers. So don't let her draw you into that. Do be prepared that she might do, because it's a big story here at the moment.
Well, interestingly enough, I did bring up the fact that the modern day Nazis in Ukraine are from Operation Gladio, from Stetsko and Bandera, and they are basically the origins, trained directly by Reinhard Gehlen and Otto Skorzeny, and basically are still in existence today. There's not, Yeah, and so I don't go with the neo-Nazi label. They're actually just Nazis.
But what has happened is because Poland today or yesterday overnight are in a big argument with Germany and telling Germany to shut off the Russian pipelines. So the whole, Poland, Jewish Germany thing and our king all at the same time being over, the whole of the UK is suddenly talking about this. So I'd just be prepared that she might jump on you with a question.
All right. I'm forewarned. Thank you. All right. Anybody else got?
I was just going to say, it sounds like the world's blowing up. Thank you, Colonel Towner. Awesome space.
Yeah, it's definitely gotten very interesting. I saw, let's see, I saw Martha.
Titanic. I know the Titanic sounds bizarre, but the stuff that's coming out saying the Titanic was deliberately sunk by the Americans, blah, 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 that's also news.
Well, somebody did it.
Hello, Colonel.
Yes.
Hi, John Last. Not really my last name, but whatever. I was going to talk to you about Operation Northwoods earlier, but you've had some interesting things come across since then. What do you know about the RDF, the Rapid Deployment Force? Pretty much the 18th Airborne Corps.
In what regard?
We have to be anywhere. Well, in my day, we had to be anywhere in the world in 24 hours.
Okay.
On the ground, ready to move.
Yeah, we have.
Did they do away with that?
We have, just like we have a unit at Andrews Air Force Base that's on 24/7. There are exceptions to what I was just generically saying. I was talking about a generic way our force is structured to a foreigner. I'm not going into specific units
Well, sure.
and what their missions are. But generically, our force structure is structured the way I just described it.
Oh, I'm not doubting you. I'm just saying it must have changed. I mean, I've been out of the Army a long time.
It hasn't changed.
In my day, we had forward observers. They were Air Force. They were attached to our unit, 2nd Battalion, 14th Infantry Regiment.
You're talking about something completely different than what I was just talking about. Yes, there's Air Force embeds in Army units to call in air support. That's not anything about what I was just talking about.
Well, kind of, because
no, not at all.
You have combat pilots on aircraft carriers because that's what they do. You're right. They do everything.
And the Marines have their own embeds to call in air support for the Navy pilots. Those are not Air Force people that are doing that.
Yeah.
They have the first 72 hours by doctrine in order to do that. There is not Air Force people aboard a ship in order to embed and call in airstrikes for Navy when it's the Marines do that for the Navy. The embeds of the Marine do that for the Navy in the first 72 hours under just normal doctrine. But if you want to go into specific units and their capability, the Air Force has several units that are on standby, like right now. They've got a unit down at Homestead that they're literally in their uniform right now, and their aircraft is armed, sitting outside the building they're sitting in. So there are exceptions and different missions in every area. I was just talking generically about how our force is structured. So hopefully that's helpful. Cousin It.
Hello, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Cool. Fat fingers. I can't unmute my phone today. Moneypenny was bringing up a couple things with the Holocaust. Today, what's today? The 27th is supposed to be Remembrance Day for the Holocaust. And actually, the big to-do is Poland didn't invite the Russians to go to Remembrance Day today. Talk about a slap in the face. So that was one thing why they're talking about Nazis and the Holocaust again, probably because of the Remembrance Day. Oh crap! And I forgot what else you brought up. That I was just going to. I totally blew my mind because I was feeding my dog. I apologize. But anyway, there you go. Today's Remembrance Day.
Okay, thanks. Guru, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, which the lady just mentioned, which was the Holocaust Memorial Day. And the other reason that they're throwing this in our face, guys, is because, we're exposing that, a lot of the Holocaust, once we find out exactly, which we do know a fair bit of what went on, was all a load of bullshit. It was the actual Americans, pushing everyone into Dresden and doing what they'd done. So again, I think this is being brought up in our face now, Colonel, because we are exposing the real truth and people are starting to learn. So they go back to the brainwashing, the Holocaust, the 2 million Jews, and they start playing on everyone's, defenses again in sympathy and amnesty for the actual Jews. You know what I mean? So again, I feel that this is a move they're doing because they understand that we are waking up to what really went on. So would you agree?
We are definitely waking up to all of our history being a lie. We are absolutely doing that. And I think the more that it gets exposed, the more questions are going to be asked. What else is a lie? And what else is a lie? And what else is a lie? Because anything that I've actually looked into specifically to Operation Gladio and the small peripheral around it that was factors played into it, every part of it has been a lie. So yeah, Cousin It.
I remembered. It was the Titanic she was talking about. It wasn't the Titanic, and it was the Olympic, and it was J.P. Morgan that sank the ship. They had the Carpathian waiting for that ship. The Olympic was uninsurable because it had been in, I think, 2 accidents, one for sure. One was with a Royal Navy ship, and they were found liable for the damage to the naval ship. And one of the things that happened with the Olympic is that the propeller was damaged and it bent the shaft. So they actually had to put, the Titanic at the time was in dry dock, and they put the Titanic's propeller onto the Olympic. And one of the things that they found with the whole exploration of the Titanic was that the propeller, the quote Titanic at the bottom of the ocean, the propeller actually had the numbers from the original Titanic, but there was the record of them putting it onto the Olympic. So that was one thing. And the other thing that they noticed when they were going around the shipwreck was that the name of the ship was actually welded on, like the letters were welded on. That's not how they did those ships. They painted them on. Nobody welded on the names of the ships. And the name of the quote Titanic was welded on the letters. And some of them had fallen off. So anyway, if you look into JP Morgan and White Star, you'll find that they swapped boats. There's a lot of stuff out there if you need it.
So are you telling me that's the reason why the people that did the deep dive in that like faulty submarine all died because they saw something they weren't supposed to?
I'm saying they didn't even make it to the boat.
Okay.
They had some DEI hire. Do you really think that some nutbag is going to be able to operate one of those stupid things without problem? Who in their right mind would get on that submarine with some fucktard, right? Who's probably got painted toenails. I'm sorry.
They
right?
got on a submarine with Ghislaine Maxwell.
Well,
there's a lot of not bright people in the world.
Well, I understand, right? But that's a little different. They were going after kiddie porn. They were motivated, but nobody. And they knew that ship like blew up within like 2 minutes of it going down. And from what I understand, the dive down to that boat is like substantial. And the timing wouldn't they were like not even a third of the way from what it sounds like. I mean, I don't know diving rates and stuff of these stupid submarines, but it none of it's kosher. But,
right.
But that idiot had no business operating that sub. There was that whole thing that came out, or am I just imagining, where they like pulled him out of the help wanted ads. He had like zero skills to operate that sub.
Yeah. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, and Astor and some other really rich fuck was on the Titanic and died. And they were opposed to JP Morgan making the Fed. That's my data.
Well, there were several on there that fit that, 3 of them that fit that criteria. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember the name. I just remember it.
Carnegie and Guggenheim.
I thought Astor was one too, because JP
Yes,
Morgan
Astor
called
as
in.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, JP
Yes,
Morgan
yeah,
called in
Astor
sick.
was on the boat.
Yeah, those were the 3.
Yeah, that's right too. And Morgan, he didn't go on the boat.
He called in
because
sick. He called in sick.
No, he had to babysit his freaking statues.
I know. That's what I said. He called in sick.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. But I mean, for real, right? And there was no big fanfare for the boat. And one of the things that they were talking about is like when the Olympic went into the water, they had like this big, huge band and everything else. And there wasn't that for the Titanic, quote unquote Titanic. And the carpeting in the boat. All of a sudden there's carpeting in the boat. And there wasn't carpeting in the original pictures of the Titanic. So anyway, there you go. All
right. So Sonia had just sent me a message and said, God bless her, said that some of my viewers are literally saying you're the best guest I've ever had. And that's waking up from a dead sleep and having like 5 minutes to drink my coffee at 4 o'clock in the morning. So she should get me right about this time of day. We'd really knock their socks off. All right. So anyway, I'm going to jump off here. Our 2 hours is up and I'm starving. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. And we will, are we doing the pond tonight, Trump?
That's the plan unless something comes up.
All right, 8:15. And let me look real quick at what else we have. Friday, this time, 4 o'clock, we're going to interview Miss Martha and how basically the federal government stole her family's property out in Las Vegas. So you definitely don't want to miss that. I will be doing, let's see, I'm going to be doing the Alpha Warrior show if he doesn't like wimp out on me again. And then Thursday at noon, we'll be doing another podcast with War Hamster. And that's it, man. That's a light week. I don't have 4 on Thursday. Oh my gosh. Anyway, yeah. So we're good to go tonight at 8:15 and tomorrow at 4 o'clock here. So.
And hopefully Eric Hunley on Wednesday at 4.
And what?
Eric Hunley at Wednesday at 4.
Oh, I didn't know that got set up. All right, 4 o'clock.
Hopefully. I mean, he said yes, but I'll confirm it tomorrow.
All right. I'll put that on here.
I was going to say one last thing too. So Brad Garlinghouse, which is the head of Ripple, NVIDIA lost $589
million, I think it was today, with the market crash. Anyway, Brad Garlinghouse, head of Ripple, he follows 589. That's supposed to be some sort of a code. So just kind of keep an eye on the markets.
Yeah, that's the deep state. Oh, I mean, DeepSeek, the name of the new Chinese AI. I've had a fascinating conversation about that because the amount of Americans that attacked me saying China couldn't do technology and they were nowhere close to the United States. And today they've released basically Chap GPT-4, which they only spent a matter of million on, not billion, and they've open sourced it and given it to everybody free, and it's destroyed the tech sector of the American stock market in a day.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
I stuck the video in the purple pill earlier.
Very clever. And then there was an attack that was made on it, a cyber attack to try and infiltrate the site or bring it down, one or the other.
Gosh, who would do that? Who would do that?
The CIA. Probably going to be the United States, I would think. It's not going to be China, is it?
No, it's not going to be China, and it's not going to be Russia. So yeah, we're kind of narrowing it down fast, and we're probably one of the only ones that have the fingerprintless capability of going in and doing hacking without anybody knowing it was us. So
well, they could outsource it, can't they, to a 0-day person?
Yeah. So very interesting. Okay, guys. 8:15 tonight. See you guys there. Take care. All right. Let me get back here to oh gosh. Gotta find my screen. I have too many screens open with the Rumble on it. All right, let's find it. So I can go through all of the, don't need that one. Don't need that one. Don't need that one. I'm so bad at this. All right. So oh my goodness. Where's all my Brave? There we go. There we go. Y'all are back. I hate that when you have maximized on and then it goes away and you can't find it. Okay. So sounds like both my phone and my aging computer. I think it's me, the aging computer inside of me, not anything to do with this equipment. It's just me. Let's see. Who else? The Ritz. Well, when you consider Brandon, yeah, you might call someone a whistleblower who tells the truth at their own risk. I call them heroes. That's true, Tonto. What was the VIN on the dashboard? I don't know what dashboard you're talking about. Let's see. Lied about. Yes, there's so much that people have lied about. It's just crazy. The art of the deal. So honestly, I think that's more what's going on with all of this, but I am going to take the opportunity while these countries are in the headlines and educate America to the extent that we can about what's actually going on. So thank you guys all for being here. I'm starving. I'm going to go grab something to eat, and We will be back on Spaces on the Pond, Trump Frogs show tonight at 8:15. See you there.